In this next learning target, we're going to talk about the third setting on the camera, which we can use to change how bright or dark an image is. This is called ISO. So based on the ISO that you choose, your camera is going to be making the picture brighter or darker, but a lot of it depends on what available light you have to work with. Usually that's my first consideration when I'm taking a picture. If I'm in a really dark situation, I'll probably have to go with a higher ISO. If I'm in a really bright situation, I'm going to go with a really low ISO. The change in how the picture looks is the quality of the image goes down the higher your ISO is. So it's a consideration that you have to think about when you're taking a picture. Here's our line for shutter speed. Remember, on the slower shutter speed side, you're going to have more light with more motion blur. On the other side, you're going to have less light with more stop action, so less motion blur. Which shutter speed is more likely to stop motion blur between these two options? In your mind, you should be thinking about which shutter speed is faster, because faster stops motion. So that would be 1/500. Which shutter speed is more likely to let light in to your exposure? Again, more light happens with a slower shutter speed, so you'd want to select this one. Here's our aperture line. Remember what goes on this line. We have a larger opening, which is going to give us more light. It's also going to create a shorter depth of field, like this picture shows. The background is blurred. On the other side, we have a higher aperture number, which is a smaller opening, and it produces a longer depth of field, like this image here shows. So let's do a little review on aperture. Which aperture number is a larger opening for letting light into the exposure? Between these two options, you'll want to think about which number is lower, because the lower number has a bigger opening. So that's 2.8. Between these two options, the lower number is 5.6, so that's the bigger opening. Which aperture number creates a shorter depth of field? Well, for focus, we want to remember that little phrase that I told you in the last presentation. So the higher the number, the more you have in focus, so more of a high number, more focus. Less high of a number, less focus, so that's the shorter depth of field. So the correct answer would be f1.4. So here's the digital sensor that would be on the inside of any digital camera. It's a CCD, and it's just these little diodes that collect light, and they convert those the light that hits the sensor into zeros and ones, which then the camera computes into an image. So our ISO is a rating that expresses how sensitive that sensor is to light. These little connections to the sensor can have different outputs for electricity that goes through the sensor. The more electricity that goes through, the more it's going to absorb light. So here's our line for ISO. Just like our last two settings, we have a line that represents the dial. So the direction that we move the dial towards the left is going to be lower for the number for ISO, which means less light. To the right is going to be more light, and it's going to be a higher number. So the picture gets brighter the higher the ISO number it is, and darker the less high the number is. How is it expressed? Well, ISO is expressed in numbers that generally double between stops of light. A lot of this depends on the camera that you're using. Some cameras are going to have different stopping points along the way. But if you pick up any camera, 100 ISO is going to mean that you're collecting the same amount of light. 200 is going to be the same across all cameras. 400 and 800 and 1600, for example. It's all based on this international standard. So that way, any photographer who picks up a camera and uses a particular ISO, they know that they're going to be capturing a certain amount of light just based on the ISO. So that way, everything is apples to apples. ISO can also be called ASA. If you're taking photo 2 from me, you'll have some older film cameras that have ASA on them instead of ISO. Just important to know if that's the case for you. Here's our line, and we're going to add in how ISO affects how a picture looks. So under notes, you'd want to add in higher image quality for the lower ISO and lower image quality on the other side, so when you have a higher number. These two picture examples show you pretty clearly that there's a lot of digital noise going on in the one on the right. The higher the ISO, the more you're going to have that happen. Whereas on the left, we have a real crisp image that you don't really see any digital noise going on. So as you're selecting an ISO to use, it's kind of like a poison. You don't want to increase your ISO because it lowers the quality, but sometimes you have to drink a little bit of that poison to make a picture turn out. Because you can't always handhold a camera or capture a picture with the shutter speed that you want based on the lighting that you have available to you, because everything's based on that. Here's a little bit of information about digital noise. So that's the term that we use to describe all that fuzziness that's going on in the picture. Not blur, but random specks of color and graininess that goes on in the picture. If you were doing film, we'd call it film grain because it's actual little specks of the material within film that you see when you put in a roll that's a higher ISO. Here's an analogy for you. It's called the stereo effect. So the higher you increase your ISO, the more you're going to have this kind of effect going on. Kind of like for the stereo, if you turn the volume way up, eventually the quality of the sound goes way down. You're not going to hear it as good, and the quality of the sound will just kind of be not as good as it could be at a little bit lower volume. Here's a comparison chart showing you the same zoomed in view on an image and how the ISO affects how the quality of the picture looks. Another example here, composite picture showing you 4 different ISOs with the same image. So the last thing is, if you know that having a higher ISO makes a lower quality picture, why would you ever want to use a higher ISO? And that comes into play with just creating a picture the way that you want it to look. So for your artistic purpose in the image, making it look how you want. So if the available light is really low, like that picture of somebody with a birthday cake, if you want the picture to actually turn out, you might have to increase your ISO. So you're letting more light in through your ISO and less light in through shutter and aperture. Just because you might not be able to get enough light in through those other two settings while still getting the picture to turn out. Or let's say you're capturing something that's moving really quickly. Your main focus is on shutter, so you want to have a faster shutter. But a faster shutter speed lets in less light. So you got to get that light from somewhere, and you might have to use the ISO to increase the light in the picture. A third reason why you might want to do it is if you had a very long depth of field that you wanted in a picture. So you may choose to let more light in through your ISO to compensate for the light that you're taking away by having a higher F number. As a rule of thumb, try to create a picture with the low of ISO as possible while still getting the look that you want in the picture. Right? Quality is important in anything that you do. So you want to take the time to really make sure that you're getting a picture to look the way you want and that you're not accidentally having the ISO higher than it needs to be while still getting the other settings to look the way that you want in the picture. ISO also affects dynamic range. So besides digital noise, if you have a lower ISO, you're going to be capturing more of the value in the picture. And that's what dynamic range is again. It's the range from light to dark that the picture or the camera can capture in the image. So if you want to have a better dynamic range, use that low ISO. Sometimes that's the reason why you'll see landscape photographers using a tripod. They may be going for a really high F number to create a long depth of field, and at the same time really wanting a really low ISO so that way they have the best value showing up in the pictures. So they may tripod a camera even though it's midday just to capture a picture where they're having more light come in through their shutter with a slow shutter speed to compensate for those things. Here's just an example of a composite image using high dynamic range, but each of the images was captured with a really low ISO, so that way that dynamic range really looks great in each of the images that were composited together for it. That's it for ISO.